working this hard over the summer. I got to take my I take my hat off to you, and I take my hair off to you as well. So I am the education director at the Roosevelt Presidential Library, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about what we do at the library, how we came to be, and then talk a little bit about Roosevelt and his leadership, and show you and talk to you about some documents that have kind of led to that. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers. And I understand some of you have got some pretty good questions that you're looking to have answered. So the idea of presidential libraries themselves, boys and girls, starts with none other than George Washington. Washington, as you know, was our nation's first president. And nobody had ever been president before. So nobody really knew how to do the job. Now, Washington felt pretty confident that he was going to be able to do it because he'd been head of the Continental Congress, head of the Continental Army, big shot landowner back in Virginia. So he knew how to get stuff done. And he said, well, this is good. This is what you need in a president, because we had just come through 8 years of war with the British, right? Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, millions of dollars spent, 8 long years of toil and hardship and suffering and sacrifice. And he knew that if the United States of America, this experiment that we call the United States of America, didn't work, that the British would be back and they would hang all the founding fathers, and they would, reinstitute their rule over the American colonies. And so he said, we got to make sure this works. So one of the things he decided to do was he set this idea of a tradition that the president serves for 2 terms. So basically you're elected, and then if you can get reelected, you're elected to a 2nd term, and then that's probably enough for anybody. And that set the political tradition that the president serves for 2 terms. And that lasted from 1800 all the way on up to 1940, when President Roosevelt ran for a 3rd term and won a 3rd term. One of the other things that Washington said was probably the best way for these guys to figure out how to do is to see how I did it. And the way that I can teach them that is I will leave them all of my documents, right? I will take all my reports and my charts and my letters and my graphs and all that stuff, and I will make it available to the future presidents. And then that way they can see how I did the job and how I got the job done. So when he left office, he went back to Mount Vernon, fully hoping to organize his papers so they could be used by future presidents. But unfortunately, before he had a chance to do that, he died. And with him died the concept of the presidential library. Many of George Washington's papers that he had taken back and didn't have a chance to organize were subsequently destroyed. And usually when I ask people, what do you think destroyed those papers? Any ideas? Anybody want to take a guess? Well, if you said fire, that's a very good wrong answer. All right. Now, usually when things were destroyed back in the day, they were destroyed by fire because you didn't have 911 and you didn't have fire companies and stuff. But many of Washington's papers were actually destroyed by rats. That's right. Washington was a fancy guy, and he wrote on fancy paper, fancy parchment paper, which was super yummy for the rats. So the rats got in there and they couldn't help themselves. They just ate away at history. So it's not just historians that are hungry for history, but rats as well. Well, when Washington died, so did the concept of the presidential library, and presidential papers have been scattered all over the place. Sometimes they were placed in wet, damp basements where they became musty and mildewy and deteriorated. Sometimes they were placed in hot, dry attics where they became dry and dusty and deteriorated. Sometimes if the document had a presidential signature on it, the signature might be cut off, sold for its autograph value, and the document simply discarded. And there's reports that Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, actually destroyed a lot of Abraham Lincoln's papers because he was kind of, Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin, and there's some, talk that there might have been some resentment of, kind of having a dad that was born in a log cabin, because Robert Todd Lincoln became a big shot in the Pullman Railroad Company, and that was kind of uncool. So that's the way it was all the way on up to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt is president during the Great Depression. And he says, you know what? This is one of the major crises of this country, and historians are going to want to know how we got through this. So he said, I'm going to make my papers available when I leave office to whoever follows me so they can see how you handle Great Depressions, and historians can get a sense of how we've handled this as well down the line. So he calls up the Library of Congress and he says, hey, you want my papers when I leave office? And they say, well, how many do you have? And when he tells them, they say, whoa, we don't have room for all that. You know, we'll take a couple of these and a few pages of that and a little bit of this and some of that. And Roosevelt says, no, you won't. You take everything or you take nothing. So they said, well, then we're going to have to take nothing because we don't have enough space for it. So Roosevelt decided to build his own presidential library all by himself. And he decided to build it on his own property. And he raised $376,000 and from friends and associates, all privately raised money. So it doesn't cost you taxpayers or me a taxpayer, any taxpayers money to build a presidential library. Once they're built, they are, it's all privately raised money, so you just ask your friends and associates for money. You build the presidential library, then it's turned over to the National Archives. And in our collection, we have enough papers. We have 17.5 million pages of documents. Let that sink in for a minute. 17.5 million pages of documents. And the remarks I'm making today are all based upon information that comes from those 17.5 million pages. Now, how do you put your mind around 17.5 million pages? Really hard to do. So let's put it in perspective. If you took all of our papers and you stacked them on top of each other, you would have a stack not as tall as one Washington monument, not as tall as 2 Washington monuments, but you would have a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stacked all of these documents on top of each other. And that is a lot of documentation, that's a lot of material, and that's where we get this information from. So if you're looking for material about the Roosevelts, and I understand some of you are, our archive is a great place to begin. President Roosevelt sketched out what he wanted the presidential library, his presidential library to look like on a yellow legal pad, and he wanted it to have a large sloping roof up here. He wanted it to have big windows along the bottom. It built around a nice inviting porch, and he wanted it covered in Dutchess County fieldstone. And Dutchess County fieldstone is exactly what it says. It's stones that were found in the fields when it was an active farm, and you'd hit a stone, you move it over to the side, you build a wall, and then when it came time to build a presidential library, he decided to build the presidential library. So from this rough sketch, an architect and builders created this. And this is what our presidential library looks like today. In here, we have the 17.5 million pages of documents. We also have about 150,000 images of the president, about 53,000 books, and about 35,000 museum objects. All these things that come to tell the story of the Roosevelts. It was built in 1939, and it took about 2 years to build it. And it was built toward the end of Roosevelt's second term. So not only do we have the nation's first presidential library, but we also have the only presidential library that was used by a president while they were actually president. And President Roosevelt returned to Hyde Park over 200 times throughout his third term and his fourth term. The library was built toward the end of his second term, and he was able to use it throughout his third term and his fourth term. And this is a picture of what his presidential study looks like, his office. And he has his desk in there, and you may notice he's got a nice fireplace and a lot of ship models and a lot of ship paintings. President Roosevelt was very much a lover of the sea. He was an old Navy man. And if you look, you could see a wheelchair in there. Okay, this is one of the president's wheelchairs right there. And I don't know if you can notice, but it's nothing more than a kitchen chair that the legs have been cut off of, and it's been built on a metal frame. Let me show you a model of that. So this is what the president's wheelchair looks like. He designed this himself. because back in the 20s and 30s, wheelchairs were big wicker affairs, very big pieces of furniture, very difficult to move around. So he designed this so that he was able to move around pretty quickly, pretty easily. It's nothing more than a kitchen chair. The legs have been cut off of. It's been placed on a metal frame with the big wheels in the front and the little wheels in the back for added maneuverability. It's got a place for him to rest his feet. And you'll notice that there are no arms on the side of this chair, right? That's so that the president could then slip from this chair into a more comfortable chair. Because polio, boys and girls, is in fact a muscle disease, not a nerve disease. So the president couldn't move his legs because the muscles wouldn't work, but he could feel his legs. And because he wasn't able to move his legs, his muscles atrophied, and so his butt muscles atrophied too. Atrophied means, went away. So he wasn't using his muscles, so they kind of wore out, and when he would sit, he would be sitting right here on this hard chair, and so what he would do is right on his spine bone. It was very painful, so he would then slide into a more comfortable chair every chance that he got. You may also notice that there is a little circular thing here. This is not a cup holder, it is an ashtray. And we always like to tell all the kids that President Roosevelt was a big-time smoker, and today he's dead. So keep that in mind. Somebody offers you a butt, don't take it. President Roosevelt was president during the two greatest crises of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II. And I just want to show you some quick pictures of those. Here is a Depression bread line in New York City. Look how long that line is, right? You got these guys going all the way from here, all the way back, and then around the corner. This was in February of 1932 on 6th Avenue and 42nd Street in New York City. So these are all guys that are lining up for a bread line, basically a free meal, watered down soup, a piece of bread, and maybe a cup of coffee. It's going to be their only meal of the day, but it's either that or starve. This is what kids your age might have looked like back in that day. Notice the clothes these kids are wearing, right? Not exactly, the coolest clothes, right? Not in good shape. Well, people didn't have a lot of money back then. There was an old saying, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. So, you didn't do a lot of wasting back in those days because there wasn't a lot of stuff to waste. And these are kids that are working on a farm, and that's the way they're dressed. So those were the two major crises, the Great Depression, and then also, of course, World War II. And I heard a rumor that somebody out there is a big Winston Churchill fan. So I pulled out this picture of the big three. And there you see President Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill, who of course was the leader of England during World War II. So the president also ran this huge alliance, that fought Hitler, that defeated the Nazis in World War II. So those were the two major crises that he faced during his time in office. And keep in mind that he did all this from a wheelchair, right? He's the only person ever elected to such a high office, not just in the United States, but in the world, with such a severe disability. He did all of the work of the presidency from a wheelchair. And needed help to, stand up, needed help to go to the bathroom, very tough existence in what he had to do. We also have in our collection pictures, like this is one of my favorites. Any idea who this little girl is? Well, it's not a little girl. Trick question. This is actually FDR. And this is him when he's about 3 or 4 years old. And it was very popular back in the day in fancy people in England to dress their kids with long hair and what were called, they weren't dresses, they were called smocks. So Mrs. Roosevelt, FDR's mother, kind of considered herself to be kind of all that. And she said, all right, I'm going to copy the British and the European royalty, and I'm going to let my kid, Franklin Roosevelt, wear long hair and smocks until he's about 7 years old. And so she dressed him in kind of the European fancy style till he was about 7. And then here is a picture of him when he is just a little older than you guys. He's probably maybe about 16 or 17 in this picture. So this is what he was looking like then. And you can see he's all got his nice suit on and hair all combed and everything, looking like a pretty, pretty sharp looking kid. And then I want to show you also a very rare picture. And this is a picture of Franklin Roosevelt in color. And you can see, look how blue his eyes are. All right, and this is a picture that was put out in 1944 when Roosevelt was running for his fourth campaign. Many people thought he was too sick and too old to run for the presidency, and the black and white pictures were not very flattering for him. So they put out these pictures, this picture, I should say, to show him looking nice and colorful and those deep blue eyes and looking very serious about getting reelected and ending the war and creating a new sense of peace in the world. So if you're looking for information and material about the Roosevelts, the Roosevelt Presidential Library is the place to be. And we keep our documents in Hollinger boxes that look like this. These boxes each contain anywhere from 800 to 1,000 pages of documents. And we have about 22,000 of these in our collection. And this is what the documents are stored in. So if you were to come to do research here, you'd go to the research room and the archivist would retrieve the documents from these boxes for you to look at and continue to do your research. And there are currently 13 presidential libraries around the country. I'm speaking to you from the Roosevelt Library way up here in Hyde Park, New York. And these are the other ones that are around the country. There are currently 13. Every president since Roosevelt has built a presidential library. And it's all built the same way, privately raised funds. So it doesn't cost the taxpayers anything to build a library. Once they're built, it's privately raised money, then they're turned over to the National Archives and Records Administration, and they become part of the National Archives. So that's a real quick and dirty history of the presidential library system. And I now want to talk to you a little bit about FDR and his leadership. And then, then again, like I say, we'll open it up to question and answers at the end. And I do see some coming in, so I will address those in just a minute. So Roosevelt was a great president, and we consider him to be a great president, not so much because we always agree with his policies, but he was a great president because he ran and won 4 national elections, only president ever to be elected 4 times. He saw us through 2 major crises of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II, and he had 2 dress rehearsals for the presidency. The first was he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. So he was in the Navy during the First World War, and he basically ran the Navy during that war. And so he learned how to get ships and men and supplies and material across the ocean to Europe to fight the war. This was a very good set of skills to have when he finds himself as commander-in-chief in 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and now suddenly we are in a war with Japan across the sea, and then we get into a war with Hitler across the other sea. And so he's got this experience of how do you gear up troops, how you get men and supplies and material to these places to fight in the wars. He also was the governor of the state of New York during the first 4 years of the Great Depression. And what that means is he was able to try out some of his New Deal programs as small experiments here in New York State first, and then ratchet them up to the federal level to become what we know as the New Deal. And if you ask the average person, can you name some New Deal programs? They'll say things like, well, there was the CCC and CVS and ESPN, and no, those weren't really programs, but there were actually 44 programs of the New Deal, and here is the periodic table of the New Deal to prove it. So most people will only be able to answer 1 or 2, but the Roosevelt administration was a big deal because it accomplished so much. All these programs meeting the economic disaster of the the Great Depression. And then, of course, there's also a periodic table for World War II, which talks about Roosevelt's leadership during the Second World War as well. And I don't know, I mean, if you have one of those in your classrooms, but I'd be happy to send you a set so you can have them there for that as well. So Roosevelt gets elected, and he is our leader, and he is a great leader because he has leadership in two very important ways. When we talk about leadership, we often talk about leadership as being in your personal qualities and also in what are called process qualities. And your personal qualities are the things that you have in yourself as a person. You know, are you honest? Are you able to communicate? Do you have integrity? Do you have empathy? Do you have the ability to communicate? And communicate means me talking to you, and then also me listening to you and finding out what it is that you want me to do. If you don't have these personal qualities, you know, you need to develop them because they're very important leadership qualities. Some people have those and are very good at those, and that's great. And then there's also this thing called process qualities. And the process qualities are understanding how the machinery of leadership works. So you have to be able to understand the mechanisms at your disposal. All right, I'm president. What does that mean? What can I do? What powers do I have? What limits do I have? What allies do I have? What devices and incentives can I use against people to get them to do, you know, things my way? What rewards can I give them to do my way? And what made Roosevelt such a great leader was that he had these personal qualities of integrity, the ability to communicate, honesty, trustworthiness, empathy, all those. And he also had a very good handle on the mechanisms of leadership. He knew how to get laws passed. He knew how to get legislation through Congress. He knew how to cut deals. He knew how to build alliances. He knew how to work with other people and other countries to get the job done. Now, I hope that all makes sense so far, and I know we're going through this quickly, but there's so much ground to cover. Sometimes I wish I worked at the Ford Presidential Museum. You know, he was only president for 2 years, so it's much easier to get through everything. But when you got a guy that was president for 12 years, it takes a lot longer. But those are the challenges Roosevelt had. Those were the, you know, the things that he met, and he had those two halves of that leadership. I would describe Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt as what I would call futurists. And what I mean by that is that the Roosevelts saw where they were, and they understood where they were. They saw the conditions that they were living in. They weren't, you know, putting on rosy-colored glasses and saying, "Oh, everything's so wonderful." Things were not wonderful while they were in office. There was the Great Depression. 25% unemployment, you know, 1,000 banks going under every month, you know, 1,000 people losing farms every month. There was a world war, 60 million people killed over the course of 6 years. They saw how rotten conditions were, and yet they didn't let it get them down. What they said was, okay, here's where we are. Here's what the reality is. And they always had a vision for what they wanted things to be. They always had a vision of where they wanted to go. They always had a vision of how they wanted things to come about and to be for people. And then once they saw where they were, you know, created this vision of where they wanted to be, they built the pathways to get there. And that's what leadership is all about. How do I build the pathways to get where I want to go? Good leaders have a vision. Right? Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream," right? He saw where he wanted race relations to be in this country. And then he worked to build pathways to get there. He knew we weren't there in his time. We're still not there now. But he saw where he was, envisioned where he wanted to be, and then built along that way as well. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, one of the most important things to him was he did not ever want to have a third world war. He was in the First World War as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he saw 11 million people killed. He was in the Second World War as President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and the leader of the coalition that defeated Hitler. and he saw 60 million people killed. And he was developing the atomic bomb, which he knew, if used, would kill hundreds of millions of people in a third world war. He would not let it happen. So what he was trying to do was to build pathways to a future where there would be a world organization and the United States would be a world leader. And he did that through a series of documents. And I want to share those with you very quickly. Okay. Should I take a break and talk about some of the questions that I'm getting here first, so we don't get too far out from ahead of those? What do you think? Let's see, I think I answered that one, how the library was built, when it was built, how many books or texts does it have? I answered that. Can you access FDR's material online? You can access 1 million pages of it online through our Franklin search engine. Did people realize FDR was an anti-Semite? Well, he wasn't, and I can talk more about that in a couple of minutes. Let's see, was there ever an attempt on FDR's life? Yes. Giuseppe Sangarin tried to kill him on Valentine's Day in 1933. He did not hit President Roosevelt, but he did hit the mayor of Chicago, who was with the president, and he was actually killed. What was his idea and beliefs on the Japanese-American internment camps? Wow, these are questions you can't answer in just a few minutes. It takes a long time. But basically, the idea of the Japanese-American internment camps was that it was a compromise solution to allow the military to create exclusion zones where they could keep people out, that they were afraid could be a threat to American security. And the military, the president issued an executive order, 9066, which allowed the military to create exclusion zones. And what President Roosevelt was thinking about with the exclusion zones were things like airports, seaports, rail lines, bridges, that sort of stuff. But the military went berserk, and they created just two, I shouldn't say they went berserk, but they went kind of overboard, and they created 2 exclusion zones. One was the entire west coast of the United States, and the other was half of the bottom portion of the United States. And they rounded up the Japanese Americans and took them out from there. FDR won a huge landslide in his first 2 elections, and then the elections got narrower as time went on. And there weren't any other real popular folks. He pretty much dominated the Democratic scene from 32 all the way on up to 44. Downton Abbey, as far as I'm aware, was not filmed in Hyde Park, so I don't know anything about that. And what about his childhood? Oh, his childhood affected his leadership? Good question. Because he was an only child, and his parents doted on him, and they gave him everything that he wanted. And everything that he needed. And so he had this incredible sense of confidence. Again, it builds into this idea of being a futurist. Here I am, I'm little old Franklin Roosevelt. I don't have what I want. What I want is a pony. What I want is a telescope. What I want is, to go to Europe. And his parents then helped him create pathways to do those kinds of things. What did he do when he was younger? Well, he went to school. He was homeschooled until he was 14. Then he went to Groton School. His hobbies were things like he liked to read. He liked to collect stamps. He had over 1 million stamps in a stamp collection. He liked to collect books. That's how we ended up with the 53,000 books in our presidential library. He was a horseback rider. He liked to ride horses before he, contracted the polio. Did he ever regret becoming president? No, he loved being president. He totally loved the job and loved what he had going on in terms of being president. So those are the questions that I see here so far. Although some more are coming up, but let me get back to the documents for a minute. So Roosevelt says, okay, we're in this world war. This is my 2nd world war I've seen in my lifetime, World War I and World War II. I don't want to see any more world wars. So through a series of documents, he creates this vision of what he wants the world to look like. And the first document that I want to talk about is a thing called the Atlantic Charter. And this is the president meets with Winston Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland, and they agree that they're going to work together to create a world where there is no territorial aggrandizement, where people aren't taking each other's territory over, where self-government is the way things are done, right? So nobody's telling anybody else what to do. The people of each individual country is telling themselves what to do. He wanted to restrict trade restrictions so that people could get the supplies that they needed from other countries back and forth. He wanted there to be freedom of the seas so that when you were shipping this stuff back and forth, you didn't have to worry about your stuff being sunk. And he wanted freedom from fear and want in the world. And this is where he mentions this idea of fear of freedom from want. So what he does is he gets together with England and he says, okay, England, here's the deal. We're the kind of the two good guy superpowers in the world right now. And we're going to be fighting Hitler. We're fighting Hitler right now. Actually, England was. We weren't yet. And when we win this war, what's the world going to look like? What do we want? What's the vision that we want the world to look like? And these are the things that they were talking about: free seas, free trade, no territorial aggrandizement and such. And they basically wanted to define what it would mean to win. Okay, and that's really, really important. You know, think about that in the current situation. What does it mean when this pandemic is over? Does it mean we've controlled it? Does it mean we've gone completely back to normal? Does it mean we have to accept that a certain number of people are going to get sick and die? What does it mean when we win? And unless you have a clear vision of that, how do you know how to build those pathways, you know, in order to get there? The president gave a speech, a State of the Union address, which is called the Four Freedoms speech. And I want to show you a copy of it. I have here. This is a draft copy. Okay, so it's on page 17, and you can see the president has, you know, crossed out certain parts and he's changed words and things. All right, so proofreading, very important when you're writing. You know, write down what you want to write down, but it's really important to go back and to proofread it and to change things and to make corrections and changes to make the writing better. And he says in this, in a future world which we seek to make secure, right? So again, this idea of a vision, we look forward to a world founded on four fundamental essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world, not the United States, everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world, not just in some countries, but everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. So in other words, freedom from want. You should have food. You should have access to education. You should have a good place to live. You should have good clothes. We want to make this possible for everybody in the world. And the fourth freedom is freedom from fear. So that, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments, such to a point that no nation can impose physical aggression against any other nation. So Roosevelt's saying, okay, you know what? I want to live in a world where it's all based upon these four freedoms. If you have to go to war, these are the four things you fight for: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And Norman Rockwell, a famous painter, paints portraits of these. And this is what freedom of speech looks like. Somebody standing up in a town hall meeting, saying their piece, everybody else listening to them, right? Everybody else may not agree, but you get to be able to say what's on your mind. Freedom of speech. Freedom of religion and worship, right? So some people here are praying, some people are just contemplative, right? But, you know, nobody can tell you, you know, what your God is or who your God is or how to worship your God. That's an individual decision. Freedom from fear, okay? And this is this idea that you ought to be able to sleep at night, not worried about things in your neighborhood, not worried about, you know, nations taking you over. Then also freedom from want. And this is this idea of having food and shelter and clothing. This was actually, the four freedoms were articulated, were spoken by President Roosevelt in 1941. And by 1943, Norman Rockwell had painted these pictures. This was actually kind of a controversial one because it shows this big American bounty. It's a Thanksgiving dinner. Everybody's chowing down, right? You know, and much of the world was starving when this picture was painted because of the war. Now, you may have noticed that two of the freedoms are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and two of the freedoms are freedoms from fear and freedom from want. And the idea of this is the freedoms of are things that are given to you by nature, by the state of nature. By the fact that you are a human being, you have a right to express yourself. By the fact that you're a human being, you have a right to believe in your God. Freedoms from want and freedoms from fear are things that you are not going to have in the natural state, right? You're not just going to automatically wake up and say, hey, I'm not afraid of anything, or hey, I've got everything that I need. And so the government has to come in and create protections for you so that you have freedom from fear and freedom from want. So the government comes in and makes sure that you have food and clothing and that you have the safety that you need, and that you don't have to worry about, you know, crime excessively or being taken over, you know, by other countries and such. So that's the idea of the want and the idea of the and the from in terms of those speeches. I want to share with you the D-Day speech. I understand you guys took a look at this. So look at this. This is, I'm not sorry, not D-Day, the Day of Infamy speech. So if you look at this, one of the things I really like about this speech is FDR is laying out the pathwork for creating the United States as the ones who are going to stand against the aggression going on in the world, as the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and of course they are allies with Hitler. And so he says, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Now, originally he had written a date that will live in world history, and he crossed that out and he wrote infamy. So again, this idea of proofreading, right? The day of infamy stands out much better than the date that will live in world history, right? It doesn't have the same ring to it. So by doing some proofreading, improving his word choice, he creates a phrase that has lasted now over 80 years, almost 85 years. You'll also notice in this first sentence, it says the word yesterday. And what this, to me, is really important, because what this means is that the president did not talk to the Congress until the day after the attack. So the president gives himself 12 to 16 to 20 hours to think about how he wants to respond. Now today, everything is instant, right? The minute something happens, like the Supreme Court made those rulings this morning, boom, it went right out on the internet, right? Right out on the news, right out on Twitter, and everybody knew within, you know, minutes of the decisions being made. Well, when you have some time to think about things, you can think them through a little bit more clearly, right? Haven't you all had a situation where you said or did something too quickly without thinking, and then you think, oh man, I wish I hadn't have said that, or gee, I wish I hadn't have done that? That's what Roosevelt is protecting himself against by thinking about it for 12 or 16 or 20 hours before he addresses Congress the next day. Today, you wouldn't have that. Today, it'd be instantaneous, and that's where mistakes end up getting made. I also like the fact that he puts in here this little caret, right? This little mark here that's like a little cap, almost like a dunce cap. And what that means is I want to put something in there. And what he puts in there are these dashes, a dash here and a dash there. And what that means is that he wants to pause at those points. So what he's doing is he's giving himself stage direction on how he wants to deliver that speech. And when you watch that speech, and I think you have already, but if you haven't, go back and watch it. And if you have watched it, go back and watch it again, because you'll listen to him and he'll say, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, dramatic pause, dramatic pause, dramatic pause, a date which will live in infamy. And then another pause. The United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked. And it's not a mistake that he pauses there. He's given himself stage direction in those places. Later on in the speech, he uses a technique called anaphora. And what he does is he begins to build, an anaphora means that you use the same word over at the beginning of a sentence in a couple of sentences in a row, and it begins to build what's kind of like a drumbeat. So he begins to build this drumbeat for the United States going to war. And he says, last night the Japanese forces attacked Singapore. Last night the Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night the Japanese forces attacked the Philippines. Last night the Japanese, and he goes on and on with this. And what he's doing is he's building this thing. Last night they attacked us. 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 And he puts a different place at the end of each of those sentences, but it has an incredibly powerful message that this is the thing that was driving and going and beating and going, and it really sucks you up into the emotion of the moment. And then in the last paragraph, and this is just his draft, so this is like, again, he types this up again and he gives it in front of Congress. He says, no matter how long it may take us, we will, to overcome this premeditated attack, the American people with their righteous might will see through to absolute victory. So again, what's he doing? He's giving us a vision of where he wants us to be. That's good leadership, right? That's good leadership. Where we want to go with this, where we want to be, and then let's create the pathways to get there. So in each of these documents, he's laying out a new piece of ways that he wants the country to work. This is what's called a joint declaration of the United Nations. And in January, the attack at Pearl Harbor happened in December, so the next month was January. President Roosevelt called all of these countries to the White House and said, look, we just got attacked by the Japanese. They're the Germans' allies, and we're going to fight the Germans and the Japanese. Anybody want to join with us? And these 26 nations came to join with the United States. Now, what's interesting about this is this line here says the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And then underneath there, it says Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. These were British colonies at the time. So they are listed under Great Britain as a colony. And when FDR sees this, he takes his presidential pencil and he says, no, that's not how it's going to be. And he takes this pencil and he puts each of these countries where they should be in order alphabetically in the world. So what he's basically saying to this is, we're not getting together to fight for the British Empire. We're getting together to fight for democracy, to defeat the Nazis, to defeat the Japanese, to defeat the fascists in Italy, so that each country can stand on its own as a free and independent nation. This is the vision he wants for the world. And by taking this pencil and putting these things in here, when Churchill sees this, he almost poops a scone. He's like, what? But that's our empire. I don't know. We're not going to fight for your empire. I'm not going to kill American kids for your empire. I will send Americans to fight around the world to defend democracies, but I'm not going to do it to defend the British Empire. In November of 1943, FDR is at a conference and he's sketching, and he sketches out what he wants the United Nations to look like. So he says there should be a United Nations, there should be an executive committee, and there should be the 4 police, which he wanted to be the United States, China, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And underneath the United Nations, what's the job of the United Nations? It's to create an ILO, International Labor Organization, give people a job, a health organization, make sure they're happy and healthy, and then give them food, agriculture, okay, agriculture and food. So if you create a situation where you have a world organization that's working toward keeping the peace, right, the 4 policemen, so if there's trouble, call one of the 4 policemen, they'll come in and they'll help straighten it out. And you're creating a world where you're giving people a job, you're giving them health care, and you're giving them food, you will have far less conflict in the world. And so what Roosevelt is doing is, again, laying out a vision of what he wants the world to look like. And it all gets articulated in his 4 freedoms: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of worship, freedom of speech. As you can see, they keep coming over and over again in these various documents. And then this is a copy of the preamble to the United Nations. And again, it's the rough copy, it's the draft, and so it's still a working copy. But if you look down here in the the second, third, and fourth paragraphs, they're talking about freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of expression, and freedom of your human rights. So again, in the Charter of the United Nations are Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. This is the vision he laid out for the world. This is the leadership that he wanted to bring about. He wanted the United States to be a leader in the world so that we could then impact and help to shape what the world would be and how the world would be that way. How did he do that? He did it with his leadership skills, with his ability to communicate, his ability to be honest, his ability to have empathy for people who didn't have such stuff, and through his ability to work the mechanisms of government, to create these ideas, to get these laws passed, to give these speeches, to get other countries to work with us. That's how it all came about. All right, so let me get back to some of the questions. Do I think polio affected his success in the presidency? Absolutely. The polio was a huge changing point in his life. Roosevelt was a bit of a gadfly when he was younger. He was rich. He was confident. Everything he wanted, he got. And he was used to the Roosevelt name, the Roosevelt money, and the Roosevelt connections to solve all of his problems. And then one night, he's 39 years old, and he goes upstairs and goes to bed, and the next morning, his legs don't work. And the Roosevelt name, the Roosevelt money, and the Roosevelt connections couldn't do a single thing to help him. And it was the first real time in his life, he's 39 years old, the first real time in his life that he realized how helpless someone could become by no fault of their own. And that gave him an increased sense of empathy with people during the Great Depression. Hey, it wasn't my fault that the Great Dust Bowl came. It wasn't my fault that the economy collapsed. It wasn't my fault that the factory I worked for went under. But now I've got to deal with the consequences. And that's exactly what Roosevelt did. So the polio was very helpful in him understanding how that kind of stuff works. His modifications, he made the wheelchair himself. He used ramps to get up and down things. Whenever you see a picture of the president, you're likely to see him holding on to someone or holding on to something because he couldn't stabilize himself. So he was always, with a cane or holding on to something along the side. One of my peers and I are creating a documentary for FDR's anti-Semitism, but we're having trouble with primary sources. All right, let's talk about the anti-Semitism. The idea of Roosevelt's anti-Semitism comes from 2 things. One is, in the broad sense, that he didn't do enough to help the Jews during World War II. And that's the broad picture. The more specific picture was that he didn't allow enough Jewish war refugees into the country soon enough. And the way this worked was that there is some truth to this, but it had nothing to do with Roosevelt being an anti-Semite. Roosevelt was not an anti-Semite. He was very supportive of the Jewish people. One of his best friends and one of his closest confidants, Henry Morgenthau, was Jewish, and he depended upon Henry Morgenthau to give him insight into the Jewish questions and such. The problem was that when the war started, there were a lot of immigration restrictions which had been passed by the Republicans during the 1920s to restrict immigrants coming into the country, because immigrants were coming into the country and taking the scarce jobs. So as the Great Depression was getting underway, we didn't want immigrants coming in and taking jobs. So there were very strict quotas as to how many people could come in from different countries. And this was a pass through the Congress during the Republican administrations, and those things were still on the books when Roosevelt was president. So you could only bring a certain number of people into the country from other countries, and each one had a quota as to how many could come in. So when Hitler takes over Germany, and now you've got thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people needing to get out, the quotas were kept on there as a cap, and they were kept on there as a cap through these laws that were passed before Roosevelt was president. There wasn't quite the support to change those laws. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the country, as there still is, and there was not a lot of support in Congress to change those laws. There was a guy by the name of Breckinridge Long who worked in the State Department, and this guy read these quotas to the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. And the argument is that if Roosevelt had done something to change those quotas and allowed, and it wasn't until 1943 that he created the War Refugee Board, which was then bringing in folks outside of the quotas because they were war refugees. So they were a new a category of people. He didn't create that until 1943, and he did that at the advice of his friend Henry Morgenthau. The argument is that had he done that in 1941, far more Jews would have been able to get out of Germany and would have been able to get out of Europe, and would have been saved. So he's kind of given the blame for allowing those 2 years to pass before he really opened up the borders and allowed more folks to come in. Then there's this controversy of, well, why didn't he bomb the death camps? And that was seen as it would likely have been a propaganda ploy by Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Nazis, of, look, not only do we not care about you, but your own, the Allies don't care about you. They're bombing you now. We're not just killing you, they're killing you as well. And so the argument was, well, maybe we should bomb the rail lines that go in to the death camps. And the military looked into that, and they didn't think it would be practical. Again, we think about today, right? We've got drones and lasers and radar and satellites and all that sort of stuff. And what happens every time there's a bomb drop someplace? There's always collateral damage, right? Because we still can't pinpoint these things quite the way a lot of people think we can and ought to. So to bomb a set of rail lines 300 or 400 miles behind enemy lines would have been very, very difficult, if not impossible, to do. So Roosevelt had a policy, and the policy was defeat Hitler, win the war, defeat the Nazis decisively, right? There was a policy called unconditional surrender. So if you were the enemy and you surrendered, you couldn't say, well, I'll surrender so long as I get to, keep my weapon, or so long as I get to, not be tried, or so long as I get to do this or that. No, you surrender, you are at our mercy. There is unconditional surrender. And he wanted that because there was a lot of loose ends during the First World War, at the end of the First World War, which were used as loopholes for people to escape punishment and escape responsibility. So by having unconditional surrender, he wanted an absolute victory by the Allies. So there could be no question about it. And the idea was, if we defeat Hitler, that will end the Nazis, that will end the death camps, and we can then begin to build this United Nations, which will ensure those 4 freedoms for everybody afterwards. Go to our website, the FDR Presidential Library website. I just completed like a 54-page curriculum guide on the Holocaust based upon the Nuremberg trial, and you'll see a lot of documents there. I think there's like 24 primary source documents that you could use for your research. Go and take a look at those. There's little short film clips that will describe how the Nazis came to power, what it was they were doing, and then why the war trials were so important to create and establish this idea of war crimes against humanity. So please go take a look at that, and it'll give you a lot of information. And then if you have any other questions from there, I'm happy to answer those as well. Let's see. All right, why didn't he respond to the Nazi riots against Jews in 1933? Well, what could he do, right? These were happening far across the ocean in another country, an independent country. What could you do? What was he able to do? There are limits to what someone can do. There are limits to leadership. Keep in mind also, there were people like Charles Lindbergh, who was a huge, not only American hero, but world hero, who was running around, who was also he was anti-Semite, and had actually received an award. Well, the Nazis aren't so bad. It's just, they're like a political party, which of course is totally untrue. So, Roosevelt was doing what he could do, but there's only so much you can do, given the fact that we're in a Great Depression, given the fact that Germany is a sovereign nation all the way across an ocean in the heart of Europe. You can't ascribe powers to the president to have superhero powers that don't actually exist and aren't actually able to be exercised. Let's see. I respect FDR, but did he care about the Holocaust until Japanese attacks? Yeah, he totally cared about. Well, first of all, the Holocaust as a term didn't come about until the 1960s, and so this was one of those things where he cared about what was going on, and he was troubled by it. But again, he was limited in what he was able to do. Let's see. Can you put the FDR library link in the chat? I can try. And how big of a role did Eleanor play in the life of his presidency? Wonderful question. Eleanor Roosevelt was a huge, huge influence and partner in everything that President Roosevelt did. And you're going to see more and more of that in the research coming out in the next couple of years. Eleanor Roosevelt has always been kind of seen as sort of the silent partner, and FDR gets all the credit for everything, but Mrs. Roosevelt was very actively involved in the things the president was trying to get done. She was an influencer of the president in telling him, her opinions, giving him insight and advice on how he should handle things. And yes, it was a hand in glove partnership between the two of them. And you can, I'm going to type this in here. If you go to our website, which is, you can get there by www.fdrlibrary.marist, M-A-R-I-S-T, that's the college that runs our server, .edu, and then go to the education page, then that is where you can access that material that I talked to. So it's www.fdrlibrary.marist.edu. Go to the page it'll be for teachers. So go to that page. You'll see curriculum guides. Go down there, and you'll find the Holocaust curriculum guide there as well. So, as a wealthy white man, what were his feelings toward African Americans? Well, as I said, he started off as kind of a person of his class, a person of his time, which is not to excuse anything, but he was from the Victorian era, and African Americans were largely seen as servants, during that time frame. As he became more politically aware, as he became more politically powerful, he understood that the rights of everybody was important, and that the rights for everybody needed to be protected and needed to be advanced. And so he did that to the extent that he could, given the political realities of his time. He created the Black Cabinet. He appointed more African American people to government positions than any other president ever had. He desegregated the defense industries so that African Americans had access to better work, better skill development, better pay. He made sure that, not at first, but eventually, after it was brought to his attention, that many of the New Deal programs were not discriminatory against people of color. So, he did do quite a bit, given what he had the time and the resources and the political support, and was able to do. What is a good email I can reach you at for questions? Good question. And I will type that in here. My email is Jeffrey, Jeffrey.urban, U-R-B-I-N, at NARA, which is National Archives and Records Administration, .gov. And you can send me questions and things there. Okay, I know you need to go. I don't want to hold you up. Thanks for listening. Listen, guys, the actions of today are the history of tomorrow. So make sure you're taking good care to do good actions. We'll see you again sometime. Thanks for letting me begin.